So, what to do? Instead of continuing in this typically progressive manner of deconstructing everything, let's point to what might be inducing some hope in the situation. The first thing that still I think is inadvertently important is to face the failures of progressivism and to be radically honest about them. And there are so many, and nobody's talking about them. It's not the things that Jordan Peterson is talking about. Progressivism has deep problems, and Emil from Hansi Freinacht has actually been talking about those, and he has had the observation that particularly many of his progressive friends are suffering a lot, even psychologically. They're not in a very, very good mental state, and that's just the reality of it. The dangers of progressivism are not fascism. They are not a stratified hierarchical society which oppresses you by not giving you free speech and not allowing you to express yourself. This is the thing that conservatives are usually spreading, the idea that progressives have been taken over by basically by radicals who are running the whole thing, by radical psychopaths. I mean, if you listen to Jordan Peterson, this is absurd. These are not the real problems of progressivism. The real problems of progressivism are rather on the lines, for example, that progressives usually tend to overemphasize self-doubt and self-criticism. This is a much more typical progressive feature. So instead of being proud and defending a position and going out into the world and doing some form of mission, right? They're not missionaries. Progressives are not missionaries. And those who are usually have issues. But they're actually constantly self-questioning, self-doubting. Everything that they built the day before, they question the next day they wake up. There is no coherent sense of identity, coherent sense of who you actually are and what you actually stand up for. This goes, of course, hand in hand with a relatively low form of motivation, relatively low drive, oftentimes with depression, nagging self-doubt, even self-hatred. These are typically progressive issues. These are things that if you just go to Balkan culture has many problems, but the typically progressive malaises are not some of them, right? People are not struggling with self-doubt. They rather have the opposite problem here in the Balkans, that they feel too full of themselves and too sure that they are, special. Another problem of progressivism is hyper-individualism. We are incapable of tribal thinking and tribal sane forms and healthy forms of tribal solidarity, to feel for your own people. And when you can't own this stuff and can't be consciously living it out, of course you live it out unconsciously. You still are tribal, but in ways that are not predictable, in ways that you don't really own. For example, you have highly tribal emotions when you see certain images on television, and you're highly, of course, associating yourself with certain people rather than others, but you're not aware of the process itself, why it happens, and you're not aware that the reason you're feeling intense, for example, solidarity for someone else rather than somebody else, is not universal love. It's not because you're embracing humanity, but most of the time those reasons are tribal, and you're not aware of it. In other words, your bias is making you feel solidarity with certain people more than others. And of course, the forces out there have recognized this, and they're hacking the system all the time. They're giving you the inputs, the right kind of signals, so that you develop a form of solidarity with positions that are actually nothing like your own, nothing close to your own. Another problem with progressivism is that progressives usually don't recognize each other when they're not embedded in the same social contexts. So when you don't use the same kind of language, when you don't express yourself in the same way, in the same polite form, when you don't use the same mannerisms, when you don't use the same tempo of expressing a thought, when you don't use the same gestures, suddenly progressives stop recognizing each other and even perceive each other, despite sharing the same values, they perceive each other as enemies. And this is a deep ingrained problem with progressivism. That is also something that we have to face and be real about. Another issue, of course, is that progressivism has not won a single war in human history. That's just not something we're good at. That's not something we've trained for. That's not an environment we have been raised in, so that we have some kind of preparedness and understanding of how you do this. The basic things that you would be able to do in such a context, apart from the really big things like self-sacrifice, giving your life away, suffering, for example, and embracing suffering, things that are much more typically part of any conservative society, like for example in Russia, people are much more willing to say, I will suffer for the well-being of my country. I think the very idea is something foreign to us because we don't feel like being part of a national identity. As most of my progressive friends and I too have backpacks ready as soon as shit hits the fan to actually leave the country, because don't we lack this sense of identity of being part of a group, and particularly not a part of a nation. That doesn't make sense. How, we are of course individuals, right? We're traveling through the cosmos. We're free, right? And the moment things get dangerous, we leave, and that's working in certain contexts when the other side allows you to do that, and when the other side is also playing by the same rules, it works. But as soon you're not in a collaborative environment, but you are in a competitive environment, it stops working, right? The moment you are in a rivalry situation, you don't know what to do. You have nothing available to you to actually win and come out on the top of the situation. And it's just the reality. It's just who we are as progressives. And I'm following quite a lot Russian propagandists in Bulgaria. They have very, very strong voices, and roughly 60% of the population really dig them and love them. It's really fascinating to listen to these guys. And they have a point when they're seeing this in progressives, and they're ridiculing it, and they're saying progressives are our favorite enemy because they don't even know that they're showing up to a fight, and they're absolutely not prepared for the fight. Because to win the fight, the cultural fight, for example, you would have to know basic stuff. Like, for example, you have to be a good rhetorician. You have to have studied history. I'm not talking about the history of mysticism and esotericism, but you will have to have solidly studied the history of a very specific culture. You have to know its mores, its customs, its ways of thinking, so that you can actually be an agent in such a form of challenge, or otherwise you will just lose. So what these guys are doing, oftentimes funded by Russia, is they're spending their entire life studying the opponent. So they're reading Churchill, they're reading John Stuart Mill, they're reading Hume, they're reading Rousseau, all these thinkers that are typically representative of the Western worldview. And they're studying them not because they're interested in learning something, but because they're interested in seeing how they can beat the enemy using their own language and using their own way of thinking. So they're literally preparing for war. None of that we do in progressivism. For us, this looks absurd. Like, who would do that? Who would study Dugin just to be prepared to beat Dugin in a debate? Nobody does that. And the result, of course, is, I think, has horrendous consequences for progressivism. If you look at actual exchanges and debates, even debates between scientists and conspiracy theorists, most of the time the conspiracy theorists actually win because they're prepared. They're prepared for a social warfare, a social conflict. They're prepared for a rivalry situation in which it doesn't matter who is right, but it matters who knows the rules of the games and who's actually prepared to win this whole thing. So you must be able, if you want to win this, you must be able to ridicule the other side. You must know what the other side is thinking, where they are actually coming from, so that you can anticipate their arguments and immediately frame them in ways that will make them ridiculous and oust them, show how silly they are. And none of this we progressives usually are. We're just not prepared for this situation. So there are many more problems with progressivism. I'm just wanting to point out that we have to be honest about those. We have to be radically honest about our weak sides and not imagine ourselves to be someone we're just not. We are not warriors, and we're not the people to win the next cultural war. What we can do right now is focus on those weaknesses and then see where we can go from there. And where we can go from there, the first thing to do is to find the right kind of to find the right kind of alliances. You have to find the people who are truly closest to you and who you can work with to build something. Look, in his entire series, John Verwicki, I don't know what it was called, the 50 lecture series that he did on personality and on consciousness. In his entire series, I think only one person he actually had to kick against and had to actually express dissatisfaction with, right, and had to criticize, was Sam Harris. And isn't this ironic? Because if you think about it, Sam Harris is the maybe one of the very few people who could be the closest ally of John Verwicki. He would be a much closer ally than Jordan Peterson. He would be gazillions of times much more of an ally than somebody like William Craig Lane or Mohammed Hijab, right? And despite that, the only person that John Verwicki found time to actually criticize and dismiss and be totally dissatisfied with and treat like an enemy, it was Sam Harris. The person who he could have a perfect, reasonable, not only conversation, but collaboration with, and the person whom he agrees with on, I guess, at least 80% of major issues, they agree with each other. If, on the other hand, you compare John Verwicki with Mohammed Hijab, they would barely agree on 10% of things that really matter. And yet he didn't mention it. So the first thing is find the people that you actually can have a productive relationship with and that you really share values with. And get away from this hypercritical splitting of hairs when somebody is not agreeing with you on certain issues precisely. I don't agree with Sam Harris on many, many issues. But the foundation is there. The foundation, like the role of the individual, the role of consciousness or importance of consciousness, the freedom to learn from different religious and spiritual traditions, including atheist ones, yada, yada, yada. I mean, there are so many points on which we foundationally agree, or the importance of democracy, the importance of self-organization, the importance of institutions. All of those things, Sam Harris and John Verwicki certainly would agree upon, and yet they would perceive each other as enemies. And that's a typical, again, this is a typical feature of progressivism itself. It doesn't recognize its natural allies. Our natural allies are people like Alex O'Connor, or the other guy, which again, I can't remember his name, the guy who does rationality rules. Our natural allies are people like Richard Dawkins. As much as we might disagree on very specific issues around determinism, around reductionism, our allies are people like Sapolsky, and not people like, take anyone on the other side, like Charlie Kirk. I'm sorry. We're much closer to those people. And if we can't create meaningful ways of cooperating with those people, building something together with those people, and those people can take up very important roles in educating and making visible aspects and dimensions of reality, which are an essential part of having an overall picture of what it's like to be in this world. They represent an essential part. You need Sapolsky if you want to have anything like a meaningful, overall, coherent picture of what it's like to be human. Even though I disagree with him on determinism and on free will, and I think he has no idea what he's talking about there. I get it, but still, you're closer to him than you are to Dugin, whether you like it or not. So we have to find ways of cooperating with those people in meaningful ways, and bury the hatchet here and actually figure out what connects us and how we can build from there. Because what we, on the other hand, are doing right now, and even Jordan Peterson did, right, when he invited Mohammed Hijab, in our inability to cooperate with each other across those minor differences, right? The minor differences between John Verwicki, for example, and Sam Harris. In our inability to cooperate with each other, we turn to sides, romanticizing them, that have so little in common with us that we couldn't even have a conversation with them. Have you listened to the talk between Jordan Peterson and Mohammed Hijab? It was painful. It was painful because he was, in his experience, that he can't really talk to progressives. What did he do? He turned to somebody who he doesn't share anything with. It's an entirely different world. It's like you trying to discuss and get somewhere with Dugin in the same space. It's not possible. It's not going to happen. Because you are actual real enemies. You are in a rivalry situation. And expecting that magically, miraculously, just by talking to each other, you will get somewhere. You will come to some kind of higher synthesis between the two views is absolutely mind-bogglingly absurd and impossible. You can get to a synthesis between you and Sam Harris because you already share enough values, like mutual recognition, feeling that you're in the same boat together, a joint sense of being confused and not knowing what's going on. You are much more likely to come up with something that is resembling a synthesis than with somebody who doesn't share your foundational assumption that we are equals in the first place. Dugin doesn't recognize you guys and me as equals. We're not. We're foreign. Same thing with Mohammed Hijab. He wouldn't recognize you as an equally valid interlocutor. He doesn't look to you as somebody who's equal and who he can learn something from. Same thing with Charlie Kirk. The whole thing was a nightmare that happened to him. Just focusing on what he was doing, he was not using free speech and debate. He was not debating with people, and he was not interested in understanding the other side. Of course, he was mostly a rhetorician. He was actually trying to make a point, to score a point, and he was not really interested in his opponents. But he was, of course, using the right means. He was doing it all perfectly within the bounds of what is acceptable socially and the bounds of what we should do to never incite violence against each other and never even officially disrespect each other. But Charlie Kirk wasn't somebody who truly had a recognition for the other side or any kind of intrinsic interest for learning something from the other side. So again, you can't get together with someone like Dugin, Charlie Kirk, or Mohammed Hijab and expect that miraculously you will be able to get somewhere together. It's absurd. The most likely, again, scenario is find somebody who shares enough common values with you and go from there. And again, Sam Harris is one of those people. I'm sorry. And even in the situation right now, after the massive radicalization and polarization that's happening on a global scale, Sam Harris is still one of the few voices that you could at least have a reasonable exchange with. Try having a reasonable exchange with Bret Weinstein. Bret Weinstein is gone. He's purely ideological and purely tribal. I don't know how much of it he recognizes, but he's in a tribal mindset, or Gad Saad. You think you could have a meaningful and reasonable exchange with Gad Saad about any issue whatsoever? It's impossible. He's gone. He's tribal. He is identity politics person now. There's no possibility. Once you've shifted into that mindset, thinking becomes impossible. They're like mutually exclusive. You can't at the one hand be politically engaged and active in fighting for something, and at the same time be standing back and self-reflecting and admitting of what you don't know and admitting of uncertainties and so on. You can't expect it from those people. On the other hand, you could expect it from Sam Harris. You could expect from Sam Harris to admit what he doesn't know and to see certain limitations in his own perspective. So that's the second thing, right? First, get the real problems of progressivism must be fleshed out. And for just a brief moment of time, we have to leave the mystics aside and just look at progressivism as progressivism. It doesn't matter what Meister Eckhart say. Really, what's important is look at progressivism as a cultural movement and identify its problems. The second point, look into the world and see who the people are who share your values. Not who share a specific form of behavioral patterns that you expect and that you have stamped up and said they've gotten the stamp of this is the right kind of behavior and these people we like. Don't look at that. Look at structures of how people experience reality and how they make sense of reality, and look there for enough common ground with somebody else, like accepting certain principles, like the principle of universalism, the principle of treating everybody equal as an equally recognized member of a discursive community, like this Habermasian approach, if you want. If you don't share these values, there is no point in even trying to cooperate with each other. The result won't be cooperation. The result will be that the other side will beat you and they will laugh about you. This is exactly what will happen to you if you come to the Balkans and try living in Bulgaria. When you approach people with the attempt of mutual recognition and mutual understanding, they will take you to be weak, they will take you to be stupid, and they will run over you, and they will feel good about it, and they will not self-doubt. They will not ask themselves, but did I do the right thing? Yada, yada. No, it's not going to happen. You have, this is the thing that I've not learned, and I still can't do, but if you want to have a position on the Balkans in a if you want, rational culture, in a tribal culture, you have actually to earn it, whether you like it or not. You have to prove yourself worthy, and you have to gain respect of the other side. And this oftentimes involves sacrifice in doing things that are uncomfortable and very much against the grain of progressive thinking. The third thing that we progressives can do, one of the few advantages that we have against conservatives is simply that they are, as Vlad Wexler once put it, they are culturally bankrupt. He was speaking about Russia in this context. They don't have a narrative to offer. It was just because progressivism got so out of hands, it just had so loose boundaries and let in so many weird players and weird positions without excluding them, because it's not good at this tribal thing and creating boundaries and being sure of what's inside and what's outside, what doesn't belong inside. It's just because of that progressivism produced utter insane claims in the past, few decades, particularly coming from academia, that conservatives could actually score a few points. But if you look at their points, like what are their points? The points that they can make a distinction between who's a boy and who's a girl. Right? Good job, great. This is the next great grand narrative that everybody will swallow and find inspiring and interesting and whatnot. They don't have anything to offer culturally. Progressivism has much more interesting positions to offer because it has looked and paid attention to many different schools and forms of practices that have differentiated positions in everything, coming from aesthetics to interpersonal relationship to sexual relationships. In all of those domains, progressivism has so much more to offer. But what it doesn't have is it doesn't have a coherent narrative. It doesn't have anything that holds it together. It all falls apart into very interesting, ephemeral individual observations, but nothing that actually stands firm against any kind of resistance of the other side. So the natural advantage that we have as progressives is that we have the more interesting stories. We have the more interesting movies. We have the funnier jokes, I'm sorry. We have the intelligentsia, if you want. We have people who are highly trained and highly knowledgeable in all kinds of areas. But what we are lacking is an ability to bring all of that together into coherent grand narratives, and particularly into coherent groups of people who are mutually supportive of each other, not over focusing on minor differences, but working together in meaningful ways. We don't have that. We are not organized. And this is something we can work on. I don't think we'll solve it. I don't think our generation will solve it. I think the thing that we can reasonably expect to do, we're not going to win the culture war, definitely not. And most likely what I think will set in the next few decades is what Vlad Wexler has been predicting, which is that authoritarians will take control over culture and over political domains, because they have a natural advantage in this kind of situation. The simplicity with which they come to the table actually is an advantage. But long term, we have the advantage, which is that, well, maybe it sounds a bit cheesy, but truth is on our side. In the sense that wherever you look, in whatever domain you look, the more differentiated positions and the more complex positions usually are closer to whatever you might call truth than the largely simplistic pictures that you usually hear from more conservative and particularly more tribal forces. So I'm pretty optimistic, not that we'll fix it. I'm not sure I will live to see this. But long term, I think we have the better cards simply because we're closer to reality itself. As confusing as reality might be, as much of a mess as reality might be, and the thing that we've not figured out is how to put it all together yet. And one other advantage which we have is that we can work with structure. Conservatives have to always work with narrative. They have to find the one narrative that brings everybody together around something and centers people and synchronizes people and hierarchically structures people, right? It has to be the narrative and the leader. This is what makes conservatives tick. They're much more cult-like in the way they organize, and they're much more individually willing to bow to the leader and to bow to the narrative and to submit to the narrative. This is something that makes them strong, and this is something that makes us strong, because both of those principles are deeply antagonistic to everything that it is to be a progressive, right? We are highly allergic when it comes to leadership, strong leadership, and bowing to strong leadership. And the second point is we are highly allergic when it comes to one narrative driving us and uniting us all and bringing us all together. This is not something that works with progressives. So short term, this is a disadvantage because respectively we disperse, but long term it has an advantage, which is that if we can find systems, like for example through social media and new media, which at the moment are a nightmare, but we're far from having reached the potential of new media. If we can find structures, this is something that I've been working on, how you can use new media, for example, to organize, to orchestrate connections between people, something that Zach Stein has been thinking about as well, even though not paying so much attention on the technological part. But the technological part here is crucial because it allows for scaling. If you can scale productive, constructive human relationships across ideological differences, then progressivism long term will gain the upper hand again. What does it mean? It simply concretely means if you find ways of speaking to the young, the stuff that, for example, Joe Rogan has been so successful at, right? Traditional conservative or new conservative media like Joe Rogan have been successful at, and they've beaten progressives totally out of the water in this regard. I mean, the most successful podcasts are conservative. Long form, if progressives figure out ways of how to structurally bring people together constructively so that they can learn from each other, they can develop mutual understanding. So when you can bring in young people, inspire them to develop, to learn about music, to learn about history, to learn about sociology, to learn about theology, and to learn about mysticism, all the stuff that you've been talking about, and do all of that in a systematic way. This is exactly the opposite of what we progressives have been doing. We progressives have been eclectics. We've been just taking bits and pieces from everywhere. If, on the other hand, you do it systematically, and give people a solid foundation in music, if you give them a solid foundation in historicity, a solid foundation in sociology, if all of those fields you can coordinate and they meet new people in all of those domains to learn from and to have actually strong relationships with and create bonds with, the natural result of that will be that the population as a whole will become more progressive without the necessity of progressive leaders and of progressive narratives unifying them. And this is a structural advantage. Conservatism doesn't have this because, again, it exists by virtue of having a narrative and having a leader. And this is what makes Trump so strong, for example. Leadership, right? This is what makes his position so strong, and the simplification. Short-term progressivism can't compete with that, and we will lose most social conflicts. But long-term, conservatism, on the other hand, can't compete with progressivism. The only thing it can do is it can try to pollute progressivism so much that it becomes a mess, a total chaos. But if we figure out ways out of this chaos, of this narrative chaos of aperspectivalism, where everybody has their own perspective, everyone has their own narrative, and not through narrative. I think this is a wrong strategic decision. Many in our circles are trying to find the next narrative that will solve this. There won't be such a narrative which will unite everybody. Integral theory tried doing that. And integral theory was a minimally invasive meta-theory and meta-narrative. I mean, it was using language that we all use anyway, like the language of transcend and include. Everybody can speak this kind of language, and yet it was not capable of unifying us globally. The likelihood of finding the one narrative that will unite us all, the thing that metamodernism is trying to do, I think is just basically zero. It won't happen. It won't happen on a narrative level, but it will happen on a structural level. This is find ways of creating channels between people who don't know each other and yet can get in touch with each other and feel close to each other across their ideological bounds. Connect people across different cultural spheres, connect them globally. And this is, I think, the healthy form of globalism, where you bring people together across their own personal narratives and worldviews to meet each other as people and bond with each other and connect with each other. This is what I've been working on. I can't go into the details. The only thing that resembles an essay that I ever wrote is on this topic, on sense making and how to use new media to actually achieve that. But I'm pretty hopeful that long format, so if we look at the children maybe of our children, they will live in a world which is more egalitarian and which is more fair and much more beautiful and much more interesting at the very same time, right? We're not using these overly simplistic and silly categories to create social boundaries between each other so that we know who the enemy is and who our friends are. So that's the third point, the structural point. I think here we have a long-term advantage, but we have not even started thinking in this direction. Most of us are still focused on finding the big narrative that will unite us, like Ken Wilber did. It's not going to happen. This is just the wrong place to look for this whole thing. And what's the pragmatic aspect of this? How could you do all of that? Well, we are already doing it partially, but it's just lacking, the German aspect of order and discipline behind this whole thing. So people are already getting together and having the interesting discussions. like with Bard and all these kinds of interesting thinkers. But none of that stuff is systematic. None of that stuff is really solid. So, for example, if you're talking about Habermas, get serious about Habermas. You have build someone up who is a specialist, who's really good at Habermas, and who works with you for a month or for 2 months on Habermas and introduces people into the thinking of Habermas, so that you have a solid foundation in this area, not just have heard 3 or 4 sentences about Habermas and think you can like place him and put him somewhere. And do this with traditions, with thinkers, with musical styles, with everything that is out there and can be learned. Create a solid foundation. And having a solid foundation simply means to be aware of the principles. You don't need to have read everything by Habermas, but you need to have gotten the major ideas, structural ideas, that he can actually offer you so that you can better make sense of reality. The same thing is with Heidegger. It doesn't really matter, any of those thinkers. And this is something you can't do alone, but you can do as a community. But only if the community is serious about this systematicity thing. You have to get systematic, and you have to get systematic about studying history in depth, about studying cultural enemies like Dugin, again, in depth, and knowing where they're coming from. Not just, romantically assuming, oh, just because you have studied the areas better than he has, that you would win in a social conflict. You won't. You will lose, most likely, in a social conflict. So prepare for this as well, and do this in a structured manner, in an organized manner, so that it is interesting for people who come, so that they can learn something, right? Why do people go to Joe Rogan? Because they feel they learn something, they develop. But after a certain time, you feel it becomes repetitive. It's the same slogans. It's the elites and yada. It's the same frames that he's selling. And it kind of gets boring to everyone who's really interested in learning. And here we have a natural advantage as progressives, because we have a much, much more diverse field to learn from and actually to gain experience from than the stuff that Joe Rogan is offering. The thing is, you have to present it to others, you have to defend it, and you have to create hierarchies, local hierarchies of people who can actually teach this stuff. So a local hierarchy will be somebody having a group of people who are more competent about Habermas and therefore having more of a voice when it comes to Habermas in teaching others. In this specific context, there is a local hierarchy. It's like people coming together like a tornado, focusing, highly condensing energy, learning, and then dispersing again. Right? So you can bring in the element of hierarchy, which is necessary if you want to have social integration and a social structure, yet it doesn't have to be all-encompassing as it is in the conservative forms of organization, where the person who is at the top stays at the top forever. So we have to bring in elements from conservative ways of organizing, we have to bring elements from tribal ways of meeting each other so that you have connections and strong relationships with people that are not just ephemeral and just momentary, but that last. Friendships, strong connections of people who are actually willing to defend each other and who feel connected to each other, and yet open them up to learn from everybody that is out there in the world. So I think if we deal with those self-contradictions that Wilber as well has been pointing out, all of those performative contradictions in progressivism, you can make it work. But it's definitely a bigger challenge than just running with a conservative worldview and just doing your missionary work and converting everybody else to something that's just inherently, boring and just uninteresting. It is an interesting challenge if you think about it, and we're definitely not going to win this on the level of the culture war for now. So we'll have to most likely get accustomed to the idea, again, that we're going to lose. But the best way we can win is by at least owning where we fail and passing this on to coming generations. And those coming generations being raised in more authoritarian political systems, I think they always also will bring a sense of healthy rage that we are lacking, a sense of healthy humiliation that you have to have experience, like the people in Iran have, for example, to actually be able to create a meaningful opposition to something and to say, no, this is too much. I don't want this anymore. And I would be willing to invest energy in making a change to cultural history. This is something that we I think, lack the energy for. I don't think we have this kind of push and this kind of drive, with very few exceptions, like, for example, Bart has this kind of type of energy. Most of us don't have it. And I think one of the reasons we don't have it is because we have not been really repressed. We have not been raised in a culture which really takes your personal freedoms away. And for example, again, I've moved to the Balkans, but I've not been raised in the Balkans, right? I've not been raised here, so I lack this kind of experience. But coming generations experiencing that will take something from that experience. So the negativity that is to come is actually something important for coming generations to be able to make a difference and to have the power and motivation to actually try to do something and achieve something.